Humans have never slept more, rested more, or been more protected from hunger, cold, and predators than they are today. And yet, at no other point in history have so many people felt permanently exhausted. Not after work, not after stress, but all the time. This is not the tiredness of effort. It is the fatigue of something deeper, quieter, and harder to name. For most of human history, exhaustion arrived at the end of survival and disappeared with sleep. Now it lingers, even in stillness. Our bodies slow down, our lives become easier, yet the feeling of being drained grows stronger. Somewhere between evolution and the modern world, something fundamental was lost. And the question is not how to fix this exhaustion, but why it follows us so faithfully even when we do nothing at all. Humans did not always live with a background feeling of exhaustion. For most of our existence, tiredness arrived for a clear reason and left just as clearly. A body became tired after walking long distances, after digging roots from dry soil, after carrying water, after hours of focused attention on the landscape. And then, when the task ended, tiredness ended with it. Sleep restored strength not because it was optimized or efficient, but because the body recognized that danger had passed. For early humans, exhaustion was a signal that work was done, not a condition that followed them into every quiet moment. If we look at hunter-gatherer societies that survived into recent centuries, we do not find descriptions of people feeling drained every day without cause. Their lives were physically demanding, but their effort was intermittent. Periods of intense activity were followed by long stretches of stillness. Sitting, repairing tools, watching children, observing the land, the nervous system was allowed to return to baseline. Fatigue did not accumulate silently across weeks or months. It reset with the rhythm of survival. Archaeological evidence supports this pattern. Skeletal remains show signs of physical stress, yes, but not the chronic degeneration associated with constant low-level strain. Muscles were used fully and then rested fully. There was little middle ground. The human body evolved expecting this contrast. It was not designed for continuous mild effort spread thinly across every waking hour. It was shaped by bursts and pauses, urgency and calm. Even the concept of productivity did not exist in early human life. Energy was spent to meet immediate needs: food, shelter, warmth, social bonds. Once those needs were satisfied, there was no pressure to remain active, no invisible obligation to keep going. The body interpreted stillness as safety, not failure. Rest was not something earned after exhaustion. It was part of the natural cycle of being alive. What is striking is that early humans often slept less than modern people do on paper. Their sleep was shorter, lighter, and more fragmented. Yet there is no evidence that they experienced the persistent fatigue so common today. This tells us something important. Exhaustion is not simply a lack of sleep. It is not solved by adding more hours in bed. It is tied to how the body understands effort, danger, and recovery. The environment played a central role. Early humans lived in landscapes that demanded attention but not constant stimulation. Sounds carried meaning. Silence was common. Darkness signaled rest. Light signaled activity. These cues aligned closely with biological systems that regulate energy. When the sun set, the body slowed. When it rose, the body prepared to move. There was little confusion about when to act and when to stop. In this context, exhaustion could not become permanent. There was no mechanism for it. The body would either be actively surviving or genuinely resting. The space between those states was narrow. Today, that space has expanded into something unfamiliar, a condition where the body is never fully demanded, yet never fully released. Understanding this difference matters because it reframes modern exhaustion. It is not a personal weakness. It is not a sign of aging, laziness, or poor discipline. It is a mismatch between ancient biology and a new kind of daily life. A life where effort is constant but rarely complete, where rest exists but rarely feels safe enough to restore. And this raises a quiet question that cannot be answered quickly. If exhaustion did not exist as a permanent state for most of human history, what exactly changed when survival became easier, but tiredness stayed behind? Early human life was structured around clear biological thresholds. Hunger created urgency, danger sharpened attention, and completion brought relief. These thresholds were not abstract ideas but physical sensations deeply wired into the nervous system. When a hunt ended, the body recognized closure. When food was secured, stress hormones dropped. When darkness arrived, movement slowed naturally. This clarity mattered because the human body evolved to measure effort in episodes, not in endless continuation. Energy was spent decisively and then allowed to recover fully, without guilt or internal pressure to remain alert. There was no concept of staying on once the task was complete. Anthropological records from pre-industrial societies consistently show this rhythm. Daily life was demanding, but not compressed into uninterrupted strain. People walked long distances, yet they also stopped completely. They worked intensely, yet they rested openly. Crucially, rest was visible and socially accepted. Sitting still did not signal weakness or irresponsibility. It signaled that the moment required patience rather than action. This social permission to rest reinforced biological recovery. The body did not need to defend its stillness. The nervous system adapted to this pattern over hundreds of thousands of years. Stress responses were designed to rise quickly and fall just as quickly. Cortisol surged to support movement, focus, and strength, then declined once the immediate challenge passed. There was no evolutionary advantage to maintaining low-grade alertness for hours without resolution. Doing so would waste energy and impair judgment. As a result, the human stress system is inefficient when forced into constant partial activation. It was never optimized for that role. Early humans also lived with limited informational input. They processed what was directly in front of them: terrain, weather, social cues within a small group. The brain was not required to monitor distant threats, hypothetical futures, or abstract obligations. Mental effort was tightly coupled to physical reality. When the environment grew quiet, so did the mind. This coupling allowed cognitive fatigue to dissolve naturally rather than accumulate. Archaeological findings reinforce this interpretation. While bones show evidence of injuries and physical wear, they do not suggest a life of continuous depletion. There is little indication of systemic exhaustion affecting entire populations. Survival was difficult, but it was not mentally fragmented. Each action had a clear beginning and a clear end. That structure protected early humans from the kind of background fatigue that now feels ordinary. Importantly, aging did not automatically equate to constant tiredness. Older individuals reduced physical output, but they also reduced stress exposure. Their roles shifted toward observation, memory, and guidance. These roles required attention, not urgency. Energy use adjusted accordingly. The body was allowed to slow without being forced to remain vigilant. Fatigue increased after exertion, not simply because time passed. This perspective challenges a modern assumption. We often believe exhaustion is the price of longer life, safer environments, or advanced societies. But the evidence suggests something more subtle. Exhaustion became common not when life grew harder, but when effort lost its clear boundaries, when the body could no longer tell whether it was working or resting, when stillness no longer guaranteed safety. Seen this way, modern exhaustion does not represent a failure of endurance. It reflects a loss of biological closure. The ancient system that once reset human energy after each challenge is now denied that resolution. And without resolution, tiredness does not end. It waits. This leads naturally to the next layer of the question. If the human body evolved for episodic effort and full release, what happens when the brain is placed in an environment where effort never truly stops, even when the body does? What ultimately protected early humans from permanent exhaustion was not strength, discipline, or resilience, but alignment. Their bodies, environments, and expectations pointed in the same direction. When effort was required, it was unmistakable. When it ended, the body was allowed to recognize that ending without interference. There was no cultural pressure to remain alert once danger had passed. No silent demand to stay responsive, reachable, or productive. This alignment allowed biological systems to complete their cycles. Stress rose, action followed, resolution arrived, and recovery began. The loop closed cleanly, again and again, across days and generations. Over time, this repeated closure shaped how energy was regulated. Muscles learned when to release tension, the heart learned when to slow, the brain learned when vigilance was no longer useful. These responses were not conscious decisions. They were automatic calibrations refined by survival. Exhaustion appeared only when the body was pushed beyond its immediate limits, and it disappeared once those limits were respected. There was no mechanism for tiredness to linger without cause, because the environment did not ask the body to remain in an unfinished state. This is where the modern contrast becomes unavoidable. Permanent exhaustion emerges when alignment breaks, when effort continues without resolution, when the body completes its tasks, but the nervous system does not receive confirmation that it is safe to stop. Early humans did not carry unfinished demands into rest. A hunt was either successful or abandoned. A journey ended when a place was reached. Darkness enforced closure. Silence reinforced it. The day itself had edges. In early societies, even social obligations respected these limits. Communities were small, roles were visible, and expectations were finite. One could see when contribution was sufficient. There was no abstract metric measuring adequacy, no invisible audience evaluating output. This absence mattered more than we often assume. The human stress system is deeply sensitive to unresolved evaluation. When the question of enough remains unanswered, the body stays partially engaged even in stillness. From this perspective, exhaustion is not simply about energy loss. It is about energy that cannot stand down, a system that remains half awake because it has not received the signal that the task is truly over. Early humans rarely faced this condition. Their lives were difficult, but complete. Each demand ended somewhere. Each effort had a boundary. This understanding reframes modern fatigue in a crucial way, especially for those who feel tired despite doing less than they once did. The issue is not that the body has weakened with age. It is that the signals telling the body when to rest have become unreliable. The ancient cues that once marked safety, completion, and release have faded. Without them, exhaustion fills the gap. And this leads directly to the next question. If early humans were protected from chronic exhaustion by alignment between body and environment, what happens when the environment changes faster than the body can adapt? While the brain is asked to remain active without end, the human body evolved under conditions of scarcity, not abundance, and this difference quietly reshaped how energy is managed. For most of human history, food was uncertain, movement was necessary, and comfort was temporary. The body learned to conserve, release, and reallocate energy with precision because wasting it could mean death. Hunger activated movement, effort secured resources, and satisfaction signaled the body to stand down. This cycle was simple, reliable, and deeply encoded in human physiology. What matters is that comfort was never continuous. Relief existed, but it was short-lived and clearly bounded. The body was rarely confused about whether it should prepare or recover. In contrast, modern life offers constant low-level comfort while demanding constant low-level engagement. This combination creates a biological contradiction the body was never trained to resolve. Systems designed to switch fully on or fully off are now kept in a permanent middle state. Muscles remain mostly still, yet tense. The heart beats calmly, yet under background stimulation. The nervous system receives signals of safety and demand at the same time. Over hours and years, this ambiguity becomes exhausting. From a biological perspective, abundance is not neutral. When food is always available, the body does not fully exit energy storage mode. When movement is optional rather than required, metabolic signals lose clarity. When temperature is controlled and danger is absent, stress systems do not shut down completely, they idle. This idling costs energy without producing resolution. It is not the intensity of effort that drains the body, but the absence of clear transitions. Early humans burned energy in short, decisive bursts. Modern humans leak energy continuously. This slow leak is difficult to detect because it does not feel dramatic. It feels like heaviness, dullness, and reduced vitality rather than pain or strain. Importantly, this pattern affects older adults more strongly, not because aging causes weakness, but because the body becomes less tolerant of ambiguity with time. Systems that once adapted easily now require clearer signals to reset. When those signals are missing, fatigue deepens even as activity declines. This is why rest in modern conditions often fails to restore energy. The body does not recognize it as true recovery. It senses comfort without closure, safety without permission to stop. The evolutionary system that once balanced scarcity and effort now operates in an environment it does not fully understand. And so exhaustion emerges not as a response to hardship, but as a byproduct of abundance that never fully releases the body from readiness. This brings us to a deeper biological question. If the human body was shaped by scarcity and clear transitions, how does it respond when comfort becomes constant but resolution disappears? The biology of human energy regulation depends less on how much effort is used, and more on how clearly effort begins and ends. Inside the body, hormones, nerves, and metabolic systems communicate through contrasts. High demand must be followed by low demand. Activation must be followed by release. In environments shaped by scarcity, these contrasts were strong and unmistakable. Hunger sharply raised alertness. Movement burned energy decisively. Success brought a clear signal that the task was finished. Modern abundance softens every one of these contrasts. Food arrives without hunger. Movement is optional. Comfort continues without interruption. The body receives mixed messages, and mixed messages require constant interpretation. Interpretation itself consumes energy. Over time, this internal negotiation becomes a source of fatigue. One system prepares for action while another tries to conserve. Neither completes its role fully. This state is biologically expensive. Metabolism remains slightly elevated even when the body is still. Muscles maintain low tension even when not in use. The brain keeps scanning even when no threat is present. None of these systems are strained enough to shut down, yet none are relaxed enough to recover. This is not a malfunction. It is the expected response of systems evolved for clarity placed into an environment of permanent ambiguity. For older bodies, this ambiguity becomes harder to tolerate. With age, the ability to rapidly switch states diminishes. Recovery requires clearer cues. When those cues are absent, energy remains locked in partial readiness. This explains why many older adults feel tired without feeling physically overworked. The exhaustion does not come from what is done, but from what is never finished. In ancestral settings, scarcity forced decisions. One either acted or did not. Modern abundance delays decisions indefinitely. The body waits for a signal that never arrives. Even comfort loses its restorative power when it becomes constant. True recovery depends on contrast, not softness. Without contrast, the body cannot measure change. Without measurement, it cannot reset. The result is a slow draining of vitality that feels directionless and unresolved. This is why simply reducing activity rarely solves modern exhaustion. Less movement does not restore clarity. Less effort does not produce closure. The biological system remains suspended between readiness and rest. Scarcity once structured human energy through necessity. Abundance now dissolves that structure through excess. The body continues to follow ancient rules, but the environment no longer plays by them. And as long as comfort remains uninterrupted and demands remain unresolved, exhaustion persists quietly, even in stillness. This leads to the next layer of the problem. If abundance disrupts the body's ability to complete energy cycles, what happens when the brain, more than any other organ, is forced to remain engaged without scarcity or silence? One of the least visible effects of abundance is how it alters the body's sense of completion. In a scarce environment, completion was unavoidable. Either food was found or it was not. Either shelter was reached or night arrived. These outcomes forced the body to accept an ending. Abundance removes that necessity. Tasks no longer end naturally. They pause, they linger. They can always be extended, improved, revisited. From a biological perspective, this creates a serious problem. The human body does not rest when effort decreases. It rests when effort ends. Without an ending, recovery does not fully begin. Energy systems remain partially engaged, waiting for confirmation that never comes. This waiting consumes energy quietly, steadily, without drama. Over time, it produces exhaustion that feels disconnected from action. The body is tired not because it worked too hard, but because it never stood down. Abundance also changes how failure is experienced. In early human life, Failure was immediate and visible. A hunt failed. Food was not found. The body responded by conserving energy or trying again later. There was no ambiguity. Modern abundance blurs failure into endless adjustment. Tasks are rarely complete, but rarely abandoned. The body is kept in a prolonged state of anticipation, preparing for effort that may or may not occur. This anticipation activates stress systems lightly but continuously. Light activation sustained over long periods is more exhausting than brief intense effort. It prevents deep recovery while never triggering a full release. With age, this becomes especially burdensome. Older bodies rely more heavily on predictable patterns to regulate energy. When patterns dissolve, fatigue increases even as activity decreases. The person feels tired not after doing something difficult, but after doing almost nothing. This confuses many people. It feels illogical, but biologically it makes sense. The system is responding to uncertainty, not workload. Another subtle effect of abundance is the loss of physical feedback. In scarce environments, effort produced immediate bodily signals: muscle burn, breathlessness, hunger satisfied. These signals help the body calculate energy expenditure accurately. Modern effort often lacks such feedback. Mental tasks, prolonged sitting, and low-intensity engagement provide no clear sensory markers. The body cannot easily measure how much energy has been used. When measurement fails, regulation fails with it. Energy is either conserved unnecessarily or spent wastefully. Both outcomes contribute to fatigue. Over time, the body becomes less confident in its own signals. It hesitates. It stays alert longer than needed. It recovers less deeply than it should. This erosion of trust between body and environment is slow, but profound. It does not cause sharp pain or immediate breakdown. It causes dullness, heaviness, and a sense of being permanently drained. Abundance promised ease, but it removed the edges that once allowed the body to reset. And without edges, energy has nowhere to settle. This brings us closer to the center of the modern problem. If abundance dissolves endings and clarity for the body, what happens when the brain, the most energy-demanding organ of all, is placed in this same environment of endless continuation? The human brain consumes a disproportionate amount of energy, not because it is inefficient, but because it was built to anticipate. Long before complex societies existed, the brain's primary task was not thinking in abstraction, but predicting what might happen next, where danger could emerge, when food might appear, how others in the group might behave. This constant forecasting was essential for survival, but it operated within limits set by the environment. When night fell, prediction slowed. When the group rested, vigilance softened. The brain was allowed to power down because the world itself grew quiet. In modern conditions, that quiet rarely arrives. The brain is placed in an environment where signals never fully stop, and so anticipation never truly ends. This is not a psychological habit. It is a biological response to input. The brain does not need threats to remain active. It needs uncertainty. Modern life provides uncertainty in abundance, not through danger, but through open loops, unfinished tasks, unresolved questions, distant concerns, abstract responsibilities. These do not trigger intense stress, but they prevent release. The brain remains lightly engaged, scanning, adjusting, preparing. This engagement is subtle, but it is continuous. Over hours and years it becomes exhausting. Unlike muscles, the brain does not experience fatigue as pain. It experiences fatigue as reduced clarity, slower recall, emotional dullness, and a persistent sense of effort even in rest. Early humans rarely encountered this state. Their cognitive demands were immediate and concrete. A sound in the bushes mattered or it did not. A path was safe or it was not. Once the situation resolved, the brain stood down. There was little reason to maintain internal simulation when the environment offered clear answers. Modern environments reverse this balance. The brain is asked to simulate constantly, often without resolution. Many of these simulations are social or symbolic rather than physical. The brain does not distinguish strongly between real and abstract demands. It allocates energy based on perceived relevance, not physical necessity. As a result, thinking about obligations, possibilities, or expectations consumes real biological resources. For older brains, this cost becomes more apparent. Aging does not reduce the brain's desire to predict, but it reduces its tolerance for prolonged ambiguity. Recovery requires longer periods of true disengagement. When disengagement does not occur, fatigue deepens even if outward activity declines. This is why mental exhaustion often intensifies later in life despite fewer responsibilities. The brain is not overworked. It is over-alert. Another factor is that modern brains rarely receive confirmation that anticipation was unnecessary. In ancestral environments, a threat that did not materialize quickly became irrelevant. The brain learned that prediction had ended. Modern anticipations often linger without resolution. There is no clear signal that the forecast can be discarded. The brain keeps it active, just in case. This state of just-in-case thinking is metabolically costly. It keeps neural networks engaged without producing action or closure. Over time, this drains energy more effectively than intense problem-solving. Importantly, this exhaustion is not a sign of cognitive decline. It is a sign of a brain doing exactly what it evolved to do, but in an environment that never tells it to stop. The brain was designed to rest when the world rests. When the world remains informationally noisy, even in silence, the brain remains awake inside. And so the question deepens. If the brain never evolved to be idle, but only to rest when conditions allowed it, what happens when those conditions disappear entirely? The brain's need to remain active is not driven by stimulation alone, but by the absence of final signals. In early human environments, information arrived in bursts and then stopped. A sound was identified, a movement resolved, a decision was made. Once resolved, the brain released attention because there was nothing left to process. Modern information rarely behaves this way. Signals arrive continuously but resolve slowly or not at all. News has no ending. Responsibilities have no clear boundary. Social expectations remain abstract and ongoing. The brain treats these unresolved inputs as unfinished predictions. Each unfinished prediction keeps neural circuits lightly engaged. This engagement does not feel intense, but it is persistent. Over time, persistence matters more than intensity. It prevents the deep neural downshifts required for restoration. The brain becomes efficient at staying half awake, but inefficient at fully resting. This state consumes glucose steadily and elevates baseline neural activity. It does not cause immediate collapse. It causes gradual depletion. For older adults, this depletion is felt more clearly because recovery systems slow with age. The brain still activates easily, but it deactivates less completely. Modern environments rarely provide the silence needed for neural release. Silence here does not mean the absence of sound, but the absence of relevance. The brain rests when input stops mattering. In ancestral settings, darkness, isolation, and predictability stripped most input of relevance. In modern life, relevance is never fully withdrawn. Even in physical, quiet, abstract concerns remain active. The brain continues to simulate outcomes, assess meaning, and monitor status. These simulations are biologically real. They recruit attention networks, memory systems, and emotional regulation circuits. Each system draws energy. None receive closure. Over time, the brain adapts by lowering sensitivity. Attention dulls, motivation fades. This is often mistaken for aging or decline. In reality, it is a protective response. The brain reduces output to survive prolonged demand without resolution. This reduction feels like fatigue, not failure. Another subtle contributor is the loss of environmental pacing. Early human brains followed external rhythms: light, weather, movement, social interaction. These rhythms structured neural activity automatically. Modern brains must self-regulate in the absence of such structure. Self-regulation is metabolically expensive. It requires constant internal monitoring. The brain becomes both the actor and the manager. This dual role increases energy use without producing rest. Over years, this leads to a quiet but persistent exhaustion that does not improve with sleep alone. Sleep reduces activity, but it does not close the loops that remain open during waking life. The brain wakes still holding unresolved simulations. This is why many people feel tired immediately upon waking. The brain never fully let go. It simply paused. Seen this way, Modern brain fatigue is not caused by thinking too much, but by thinking without endings. The brain evolved to work hard, but only until the environment told it the work was done. When that signal disappears, effort continues internally, even in stillness. And this brings us closer to the core of the problem. If the brain is exhausted not by effort but by endless relevance, what happens when time itself becomes fragmented, removing the natural markers that once told the brain when to begin and when to stop? Time, for most of human history, was not abstract. It was felt through light, temperature, hunger, fatigue, and social movement. The brain did not need to interpret time, it followed it. Morning activated the body, evening slowed it. Seasons expanded or contracted effort naturally. These patterns acted as external regulators for neural activity. The brain did not decide when to begin or end most processes. The environment did that work. This mattered because decision-making itself consumes energy. When time was embodied rather than scheduled, the brain conserved resources by yielding control. Modern time removes this relief. Clocks, calendars, and artificial lighting fragment experience into uniform units that lack biological meaning. The brain is forced to interpret time rather than inhabit it. Each hour feels the same, regardless of whether the body is ready to act or rest. This uniformity erases natural stopping points. Without clear markers of completion, the brain maintains continuity. It carries tasks forward mentally even when the body is inactive. This continuity keeps neural networks engaged beyond necessity. Over years, this creates a background load that never fully lifts. For older adults, this effect intensifies. Aging brains rely more on environmental cues to regulate internal states. When cues disappear, self-regulation must increase. Increased self-regulation increases energy use. The result is fatigue that feels detached from action. The person may feel tired after a quiet day because the brain never received permission to disengage. Another consequence of fragmented time is the loss of anticipation and resolution cycles. In ancestral settings, effort built toward a clear endpoint. Arrival mattered. Completion mattered. Modern time replaces endpoints with deadlines that roll forward endlessly. The brain prepares repeatedly without closure. Preparation without release is biologically costly. It keeps attention systems active while denying reward circuits their signal to stand down. Over time, this imbalance drains motivation and vitality. Importantly, this exhaustion is not corrected by slowing down. Slowing down within fragmented time still requires interpretation. The brain remains active, monitoring clocks, expectations, and abstract future points. True rest requires surrendering temporal control. Early humans surrendered naturally because time controlled them. Modern humans must attempt surrender consciously, which paradoxically demands effort. This effort further taxes the brain. As a result, even leisure can feel tiring. The brain remains responsible for managing time rather than being carried by it. This is why modern exhaustion often feels mental rather than physical, and persistent rather than situational. The brain is doing invisible work continuously, not because it is malfunctioning, but because it is compensating for the loss of external structure. Seen through this lens, fatigue becomes a signal of temporal misalignment. The brain evolved to rest when time itself rested. When time no longer slows, the brain does not either. And this leads directly to the next question. If the brain is trapped in continuous engagement by fragmented time and endless relevance, what happens to the deeper biological rhythms that once synchronized the entire body with rest and recovery? Human biology is governed by rhythms far older than civilization itself. These rhythms evolved to synchronize internal processes with predictable patterns in the external world. Light and darkness regulated hormones. Temperature shifts guided activity and rest. Hunger and satiety marked effort and recovery. Together, these signals aligned the body's systems so that energy was released and restored at the right times. For early humans, these rhythms were unavoidable. Night brought darkness. Darkness brought stillness. The body did not debate when to slow down. It responded automatically. Modern environments disrupt this alignment at every level. Artificial light extends day into night. Climate control flattens temperature variation. Food availability removes hunger as a timing signal. The body continues to follow ancient rhythms, but the environment no longer reinforces them. This mismatch forces internal systems to negotiate timing on their own. Negotiation costs energy. The body becomes less certain when to activate and when to recover. Hormonal cycles blur. Sleep loses depth. Wakefulness loses clarity. Over time, this erosion manifests as persistent exhaustion rather than acute fatigue. Importantly, this exhaustion does not feel dramatic. It feels like a low-grade heaviness that never fully lifts. For older adults, the consequences are more pronounced. Aging bodies depend more heavily on rhythmic regularity to maintain balance. When rhythms fragment, recovery slows disproportionately. What once required a brief pause now requires extended rest. Yet extended rest often fails to restore energy. The body is resting in clock time, but not in biological time. Another consequence of disrupted rhythms is the loss of anticipation. In ancestral life, the body prepared for rest as evening approached. Hormones shifted gradually, muscles relaxed, the brain released vigilance. Modern rhythms remove this transition. Activity often stops abruptly without preparation. Screens remain bright. Information continues to flow. The body is asked to rest without being guided there. Without guidance, systems remain partially active. Partial activity prevents deep restoration. Sleep becomes lighter. Awakening feels incomplete. Over days and years, this incomplete recovery accumulates. Exhaustion becomes the baseline. This state is often misunderstood as normal aging. In reality, it reflects a loss of synchronization. The body is still capable of recovery, but it no longer receives the cues required to initiate it fully. Rhythms once embedded in nature have been replaced by schedules embedded in culture. Schedules demand compliance, not alignment. The body follows them imperfectly, at a cost. That cost is paid in energy. Over time, the energy deficit becomes chronic. This is why simply sleeping longer or resting more often rarely resolves modern exhaustion. Without restoring rhythmic cues, additional rest only extends time spent in partial activation. The body remains confused about whether it should repair or prepare. Understanding this shift is crucial, especially later in life. Exhaustion does not mean the system is broken. It means the system has lost its conductor. When rhythms disappear, every organ must improvise. Improvisation is exhausting. And this brings us to the next layer of the problem. If disrupted rhythms prevent deep recovery even during rest, how does this affect sleep itself? The process once most reliably responsible for restoring human energy. Sleep evolved as the deepest form of biological reset, not because it was long or efficient, but because it was synchronized with the world around the body. In early human life, sleep began gradually. Darkness arrived slowly. Activity faded naturally. The brain reduced vigilance because the environment itself reduced demand. Sleep did not need to fight against stimulation, it followed it. In modern life, sleep is often forced rather than invited. Artificial light delays hormonal signals. Screens sustain relevance deep into the night. The brain is asked to disengage while the environment continues to demand attention. This conflict weakens sleep's restorative power. The body may remain still for hours, but internal systems do not fully shift into repair mode. Sleep becomes lighter, more fragmented, and less effective at clearing fatigue. Over time, the body adapts to this reduced recovery by lowering baseline energy. Exhaustion becomes the default state rather than a temporary condition. For older adults, this shift is especially significant. Aging already reduces the depth of sleep. When environmental cues are weakened, the remaining depth erodes further. Sleep still occurs, but its structure changes. Time in restorative stages shortens. Awakening feels abrupt rather than complete. The person may sleep longer yet feel less refreshed. This creates a confusing experience where rest no longer delivers relief. Importantly, this is not insomnia in the traditional sense. The problem is not falling asleep. It is failing to descend fully into biological recovery. The brain remains partially alert, monitoring relevance even in rest. This partial alertness keeps stress hormones slightly elevated and repair processes slightly suppressed. Over years, the cumulative effect is significant. Tissues recover more slowly. The nervous system remains sensitive. Energy reserves feel shallow. Another consequence of disrupted sleep rhythms is the loss of trust in rest. When sleep stops working as expected, the body becomes cautious. It does not release fully because past rest did not restore balance. This creates a feedback loop. Light sleep leads to fatigue. Fatigue leads to anxiety about rest. Anxiety sustains alertness. Alertness prevents deep sleep. The cycle reinforces itself quietly, without crisis, but with steady erosion of vitality. In ancestral environments, sleep worked because it aligned with everything else. Darkness, silence, and reduced activity all pointed in the same direction. Modern environments send mixed signals. The body tries to interpret them, but interpretation itself costs energy. Sleep becomes another task rather than a surrender. This transformation explains why exhaustion persists even in people who sleep regularly. The issue is not the presence of sleep, but the absence of alignment. Without alignment, sleep loses its authority over recovery. And this raises the next question. If sleep itself can no longer fully reset the body, how does this ongoing deficit reshape daily energy, mood, and resilience over the course of years and decades? Even when sleep occurs regularly, the body still depends on daytime signals to decide whether recovery will be allowed to complete. In early human life, daytime activity prepared the body for night rest. Movement created physical fatigue. Exposure to natural light calibrated hormones. Social interaction had a beginning and an end. These daytime experiences shaped the quality of sleep that followed. Sleep worked because it was the final step in a coherent daily cycle. In modern life, that cycle is incomplete. Daytime no longer prepares the body for rest. Physical movement is minimal or irregular. Light exposure is artificial and poorly timed. Social and cognitive demands do not resolve by evening. The body arrives at night without a clear sense that the day has ended. Sleep is asked to repair what the day never finished organizing. This places an impossible burden on sleep itself. Sleep can restore tissues, but it cannot create order where none existed. As a result, recovery remains partial. The body wakes without feeling renewed, not because sleep failed, but because the conditions required for sleep to succeed were never fully present. Over time, this creates a subtle but persistent energy deficit. Each night restores less than the day consumes. The deficit accumulates slowly, often unnoticed until exhaustion becomes the baseline. For older adults, this accumulation is felt more clearly. Aging reduces physiological flexibility. Small imbalances that once corrected themselves now persist. When daytime rhythms are unclear, sleep cannot compensate fully. The body becomes cautious with energy. It lowers output to protect stability. This protective reduction is experienced as tiredness, even in the absence of strain. Another consequence of this imbalance is emotional flattening. When recovery is incomplete, the nervous system prioritizes stability over responsiveness. Energy is conserved by narrowing range. Joy feels muted. Motivation feels distant. This is not depression in its clinical sense. It is a biological response to prolonged recovery debt. The system is conserving resources because it cannot rely on nightly restoration. Importantly, this state is reversible in principle, but not through sleep alone. Recovery depends on the reintroduction of clear daily signals that once guided the body naturally. Without those signals, sleep remains isolated, doing its best within a fragmented system. The exhaustion that follows is not dramatic, but enduring. It lingers because nothing tells it to leave. Understanding this helps reframe a common frustration, especially later in life. Feeling tired does not mean the body is failing. It means the body is waiting for guidance it no longer receives. Sleep is only one part of that guidance. When the rest of the rhythm is missing, sleep cannot finish the work on its own, and this leads to a deeper question. If disrupted rhythms weaken sleep and daily recovery over years, how does this long-term energy deficit reshape the body's resilience, health, and ability to respond to stress across the later stages of life? Exhaustion becomes a different phenomenon when it spreads across an entire population rather than appearing in isolated individuals. In early human groups, tiredness was visible, temporary, and shared in context. A difficult journey exhausted everyone. A harsh season drained the group. Recovery followed collectively as conditions changed. There was no confusion about why energy was low or when it would return. In modern societies, exhaustion appears quietly and unevenly, yet it affects millions at once. People feel tired in safe environments, across different occupations, and even after long periods of rest. This pattern signals something structural rather than personal. When exhaustion becomes widespread, it reflects conditions embedded in the way a society organizes time, effort, and expectation. Population-level fatigue emerges when individual biology is repeatedly placed in situations it cannot resolve on its own. Each person adapts slightly by lowering energy output, but when many people do this simultaneously, exhaustion becomes normalized. It is no longer recognized as a signal of imbalance. It becomes a background condition. Over generations, this normalization reshapes expectations. Feeling tired is treated as ordinary. Feeling rested becomes unusual. For older adults, this shift is especially apparent. Many remember a time when fatigue followed exertion and rest brought relief. The contrast highlights how modern exhaustion behaves differently. It does not correspond neatly to activity. It persists regardless of effort. This persistence suggests that the cause lies not in individual behavior, but in shared environmental pressures acting continuously. Population studies show that chronic fatigue increases even as physical labor decreases. This inversion would be impossible if exhaustion were driven solely by workload. Instead, it points to cognitive, temporal, and social factors that operate at scale. These factors do not overwhelm the body through force. They wear it down through constancy. When millions of nervous systems remain partially engaged for years, energy depletion becomes a demographic feature. Aging amplifies this effect. As recovery slows, older individuals feel the population-wide deficit more intensely. What once felt like mild tiredness becomes limiting. Yet because the condition is widespread, it is rarely questioned. People assume it is an inevitable consequence of age or modern life. This assumption masks the underlying cause. Exhaustion at the population level is not a failure of individuals to adapt. It is evidence that adaptation has limits. Biology can bend, but only so far. When shared conditions consistently violate ancient rhythms, the cost appears everywhere at once. Understanding exhaustion as a population phenomenon changes how it is interpreted. It shifts attention away from personal blame and toward collective patterns. It reveals fatigue as a signal emitted by many bodies in response to the same unresolved pressures. And this raises an important question. If exhaustion reflects a collective response rather than individual weakness, what does that imply about the environments we have built and how they quietly shape the energy of entire generations? One of the most revealing signs that exhaustion has become a population-level condition is how early it now appears in life. In earlier generations, persistent fatigue was largely confined to periods of hardship or advanced age. Today, people report feeling drained across the entire lifespan. Young adults feel tired before their lives have fully begun. Middle-aged individuals feel depleted despite reduced physical demands. Older adults feel exhaustion not only after effort, but as a constant presence. When a condition appears simultaneously across age groups, it suggests that the cause is not individual decline, but shared exposure. Each generation enters an environment already shaped by unresolved demands. They do not start from balance and lose it gradually. They begin already slightly depleted. Over time, this baseline deficit compounds. Another indicator is that exhaustion no longer carries clear social meaning. In earlier contexts, fatigue communicated something specific. It meant hunger, illness, overwork, or danger. It prompted rest, care, or adjustment. In modern societies, exhaustion is vague. It does not clearly point to a cause or a remedy. Because it is widespread, it loses urgency. People adapt by lowering expectations rather than correcting conditions. This adaptation stabilizes the system, but at the cost of vitality. The population continues functioning, but at reduced energy. Over decades, this reduced energy becomes the norm. Cultural narratives shift accordingly. Productivity is praised despite fatigue. Endurance is admired even when recovery is absent. Rest is treated as optional or indulgent rather than necessary. These narratives feed back into biology. When rest is socially devalued, bodies receive fewer signals of permission to recover. The nervous system remains guarded. Energy is conserved defensively rather than restored proactively. Aging magnifies these effects. Older individuals grew up under different conditions and can sense the contrast. They remember when tiredness had a cause and an end. Living through the transition allows them to feel the loss more acutely. Younger generations, having never known a different baseline, may interpret exhaustion as normal existence. This generational shift is important. It means that exhaustion is being inherited culturally, not genetically. Each generation learns to live with less energy than the one before. This is not because bodies are weakening faster, but because environments are demanding more continuous engagement without providing resolution. Over time, this shapes population health. Resilience decreases. Recovery slows. The margin for stress narrows. Minor disruptions feel overwhelming because reserves are already low. From the outside, this looks like individual fragility. From a biological perspective, it is collective depletion. Recognizing this changes the question we ask. Instead of asking why so many individuals feel exhausted, we begin to ask why exhaustion has become an acceptable background state for entire societies. And if that acceptance continues unchecked, what will it mean for the long-term capacity of future generations to recover, adapt, and endure? When exhaustion persists across generations, it begins to alter how societies define normal functioning. What was once considered a warning signal becomes an expected condition. People plan their lives around low energy rather than questioning why energy is scarce. Systems adapt to fatigue instead of removing its source. Work is structured assuming diminished vitality. Social interaction becomes shorter and more effortful. Even leisure is designed to require minimal engagement. These adaptations allow societies to continue operating, but they quietly lower the ceiling of human capacity. Over time, the population functions, but with less resilience, less patience, and less margin for stress. This shift is subtle and slow, which makes it difficult to recognize while it is happening. No single moment marks the change. It emerges through countless small adjustments to living with less energy than expected. For older adults, this change is often felt as a sense that life requires more effort than it once did, even when responsibilities have decreased. The body feels heavier not because it is weaker, but because the environment never truly allows recovery to complete. Another consequence of population-level exhaustion is the loss of contrast between effort and rest. When everyone is tired, rest loses its meaning. It no longer stands out as a restorative state. It becomes merely the absence of activity, not the presence of renewal. This weakens motivation to protect rest, both individually and collectively. Policies, schedules, and social norms fail to prioritize recovery because fatigue is assumed to be inevitable. Biology, however, does not accept inevitability. It responds by conserving energy further. The nervous system narrows its range. Emotional responsiveness declines. Curiosity fades. These changes are protective in the short term, but costly over the long term. They reduce the capacity to adapt to new challenges. They make recovery from illness or stress slower and less complete. From a biological perspective, this represents a population living in permanent energy debt. Each day is managed carefully to avoid collapse rather than built toward renewal. This condition is not dramatic enough to provoke alarm, but it is widespread enough to shape collective experience. It influences how aging is perceived, how limitations are accepted, and how little energy is expected from later life. Yet exhaustion at this scale is not destiny, it is information. It signals that the balance between demand and recovery has shifted too far. When many bodies send the same signal for long enough, it becomes a message about the environment rather than the individuals within it. The challenge is that this message is quiet. It arrives not as crisis, but as weariness, and this leads to a critical reflection. If exhaustion has become the background state of entire populations, what does that suggest about the kind of world that is being passed on, not just biologically, but experientially, to those who grow old within it? Human energy evolved to be spent on actions that mattered immediately for survival. Movement secured food. Effort protected the group. Attention prevented danger. Each expenditure of energy produced a visible outcome that the body could register as meaningful. This meaning was not abstract or emotional, it was biological. When effort led to survival, the nervous system received confirmation that the energy spent had purpose. This confirmation played a critical role in recovery. The body restores energy more effectively when it understands why that energy was used. In modern life, this link between effort and meaning has weakened. Large amounts of energy are spent on tasks that produce no tangible result the body can sense. Sitting for hours, managing symbols, responding to abstractions, maintaining roles, these activities require attention and regulation, but they do not resolve into physical outcomes. The body expends energy, yet receives no biological signal that the effort was complete or worthwhile. This creates a mismatch. Energy is used, but meaning is delayed or absent. Over time, this absence affects recovery. The nervous system remains cautious, unsure whether the effort has ended or will be demanded again. This uncertainty keeps systems partially active. Exhaustion emerges not from effort itself, but from effort without closure. For older adults, this effect is particularly noticeable. With age, the body becomes less tolerant of energy expenditure that lacks resolution. Recovery relies more heavily on clear feedback. When feedback is missing, fatigue deepens even as activity decreases. The person may feel tired despite doing less, because the effort that remains feels ungrounded. Another consequence of meaning loss is emotional detachment. When actions do not produce visible outcomes, motivation weakens. The body learns that energy investment does not reliably lead to completion. It responds by conserving energy preemptively. This conservation feels like low drive, low enthusiasm, and persistent tiredness. It is not a failure of character. It is a protective adjustment. Early humans rarely faced this condition. Their energy use was costly but coherent. Each action fit into a chain that ended in survival or rest. Modern actions often lack that chain. They extend indefinitely, multiply quietly, and dissolve without clear endpoints. The body waits for a signal that never arrives. Over years, this waiting becomes exhausting. Understanding this helps explain why modern fatigue often feels empty rather than painful. It is the tiredness of effort that never lands anywhere. And this brings the inquiry forward. If the body struggles to recover when effort lacks meaning and closure, how does this prolonged mismatch reshape motivation, resilience, and the will to engage as life continues? When effort continues without producing a sense of completion, the body slowly changes how it relates to action itself. Motivation is not a purely psychological state. It is rooted in biology. The nervous system decides how much energy to release based on past experience. If previous efforts consistently led to resolution, recovery, and safety, the system becomes willing to invest energy again. If efforts repeatedly remain unfinished, ambiguous, or disconnected from outcomes, the system becomes cautious. It releases less energy in advance. This caution is experienced subjectively as low motivation, hesitation, and fatigue. The body is not unwilling, it is conserving. In early human life, effort almost always led somewhere concrete. Even failure ended decisively. The hunt failed and the day ended. The body learned quickly that effort had boundaries. In modern life, effort often dissolves without closure. Tasks merge into one another. Responsibilities stretch forward indefinitely. There is no clear signal that the investment of energy has concluded. The nervous system adapts by reducing its willingness to fully engage. This adaptation protects against burnout, but it also lowers vitality. Over time, resilience declines. Resilience is not the ability to endure endlessly. It is the ability to expend energy and then restore it. When restoration becomes unreliable, endurance replaces resilience. Endurance is costly. It draws from reserves without replenishing them fully. Older adults feel this shift acutely. They may notice that even small demands feel heavy, not because they are incapable, but because the body has learned to ration energy carefully. The cost of misjudging effort has increased with age. Recovery takes longer. The system becomes conservative by necessity. Another effect of prolonged effort without meaning is emotional flattening. Emotion requires energy. Curiosity, joy, and engagement all depend on surplus. When surplus disappears, emotions narrow. This narrowing is often mistaken for loss of interest or aging of the spirit. Biologically, it is an energy-saving strategy. The body reduces emotional range to protect stability. This reduction further weakens motivation, creating a reinforcing loop. Low meaning reduces energy investment. Low energy investment reduces meaningful engagement. The loop sustains exhaustion quietly. Importantly, this process does not require stress or distress. It can occur in calm, orderly lives. Even in comfortable conditions, the absence of meaningful closure drains energy. The body does not measure comfort. It measures resolution. When resolution is missing, the nervous system remains guarded. It holds back. Over years, this holding back becomes the default state. The person lives carefully, not expansively. Energy is preserved, but not restored. Understanding this helps explain why advice focused solely on positive thinking or increased activity often fails. The issue is not attitude or effort. It is the biological expectation of closure. Without that expectation being met, the system will not release energy freely, and this leads naturally to the next question. If prolonged effort without meaning reshapes motivation and resilience over time, how does this affect the body's response to stress, illness, and the challenges that come with later stages of life? As energy becomes increasingly rationed, the body's response to stress and challenge changes in subtle but important ways. Stress is not inherently damaging. In early human life, stress mobilized energy briefly and then released it. The body learned to surge and recover. When energy reserves were reliable, stress strengthened resilience. In modern conditions, where recovery is incomplete and meaning is uncertain, stress no longer triggers confident mobilization. Instead, it is met with caution. The body releases just enough energy to manage the situation, but not enough to resolve it fully. This partial response leaves systems activated longer than necessary. Over time, stress accumulates not because events are severe, but because responses never finish. This accumulation contributes directly to chronic exhaustion. For older adults, the effect is more pronounced. Aging bodies depend on efficient stress resolution to maintain balance. When stress responses linger, they interfere with immune function, digestion, and repair. The person may notice slower recovery from illness, prolonged fatigue after minor challenges, and reduced tolerance for change. These are not signs of weakness. They are signs of a system operating without adequate closure. Another consequence is increased sensitivity. When reserves are low, the body treats even small disruptions as significant. Noise, schedule changes, social demands, or unexpected tasks feel draining. The nervous system reacts defensively, conserving energy by limiting engagement. This can look like withdrawal or avoidance. Biologically, it is a strategy to prevent further depletion. However, this strategy reduces exposure to meaningful experiences that might restore energy. The cycle tightens. Reduced engagement lowers opportunity for resolution. Lower resolution sustains exhaustion. Importantly, this state develops gradually. There is no single breaking point. The body simply adjusts downward year after year. Because the decline is slow, it is often attributed to normal aging. Yet the pattern differs from age-related decline seen in earlier generations. What has changed is not the body's design, but the conditions under which it must operate. When effort, meaning, and recovery fall out of alignment, resilience erodes quietly. This erosion affects how the body faces future challenges. Illness takes longer to heal. Stress leaves deeper traces. The margin for adaptation narrows. Life feels heavier, not because it is harsher, but because the system lacks surplus. Surplus is essential for resilience. Without it, the body shifts into preservation mode. Preservation keeps systems stable, but it sacrifices growth and renewal. This trade-off becomes increasingly costly with age. Understanding this reframes exhaustion once more. It is not merely a symptom to be eliminated. It is a signal that the balance between investment and restoration has tilted too far. The body is asking for conditions that allow energy to complete its cycle. Without those conditions, stress responses cannot close, resilience cannot rebuild, and fatigue remains. And this brings the inquiry forward. If exhaustion reflects a long-term imbalance between effort, meaning, and recovery, What happens when the body begins to interpret this imbalance as a permanent feature of life itself? When exhaustion persists long enough, the body begins to adjust its expectations. What was once interpreted as a temporary imbalance starts to feel permanent. The nervous system adapts by redefining what normal energy feels like. This adaptation is not conscious. It happens gradually as the body learns that full recovery is unlikely. When recovery cannot be trusted, the system lowers its baseline to avoid repeated disappointment. Energy output becomes conservative by default. This conservation protects stability, but it also narrows experience. The person may feel less driven, less responsive, and less capable of sustained engagement. Importantly, this is not learned helplessness or resignation. It is a biological recalibration. The body is aligning its output with what it believes the environment will allow it to regain. In early human life, this recalibration rarely occurred because recovery followed effort reliably. Modern conditions interrupt that relationship. Over years, the body learns that effort does not guarantee restoration. As a result, it limits effort in advance. This shift has profound effects on daily life. Activities that once felt neutral begin to feel taxing. Decisions require more energy. Social interaction feels heavier. The world has not become more demanding, but the body has reduced its willingness to invest. For older adults, this recalibration is especially noticeable because it contrasts sharply with earlier stages of life. Many can recall periods when fatigue lifted fully after rest. When that no longer happens, the body assumes the change is lasting. It adjusts downward to preserve function. Another consequence of this adjustment is the reinterpretation of signals. Mild fatigue is treated as a warning rather than a cue for temporary rest. The body becomes vigilant about conserving energy. This vigilance itself consumes energy, reinforcing the exhaustion it is meant to prevent. A quiet feedback loop forms. Lower energy leads to reduced engagement. Reduced engagement leads to fewer experiences of completion. Fewer completions reinforce the belief that recovery is unreliable. The loop sustains itself without crisis. Over time, exhaustion becomes part of identity rather than a state that comes and goes. People describe themselves as tired people rather than people who are temporarily tired. This shift matters because biology responds to perceived permanence differently than to temporary strain. When a condition is perceived as lasting, systems prioritize maintenance over renewal. Repair slows. Reserves remain shallow. The body is no longer preparing to rebound. It is preparing to endure. This is why rest alone often fails to reverse long-term exhaustion. Rest assumes a future return to full function. The body, having learned otherwise, does not invest in that return. Understanding this adaptation reframes exhaustion yet again. It is not simply the result of too much demand. It is the result of a system that has learned to expect imbalance. And this leads to the next question. If the body begins to treat exhaustion as a permanent condition rather than a temporary signal, how does that belief shape the way energy is used, preserved, and eventually lost across the later years of life? As the body settles into a lower energy baseline, it also changes how it allocates what remains. Energy is no longer distributed evenly across life. It is prioritized narrowly toward essential functions. Systems responsible for survival are protected, while those associated with exploration, adaptation, and growth receive less support. This redistribution is quiet but consequential. Physical maintenance continues, but recovery slows. Cognitive clarity fluctuates. Emotional responsiveness becomes selective. The person may still function well, yet feel that life requires more effort than it once did. This is not because capacity has vanished, but because the body is guarding its reserves. In earlier life, surplus energy allowed flexibility. One could respond to stress, recover, and then engage again without hesitation. When surplus disappears, flexibility declines. Every decision carries weight. Every engagement must be justified internally. The nervous system asks, often unconsciously, whether the energy spent will be returned. If the answer is uncertain, the system withholds. This withholding feels like fatigue, but it is actually a form of protection. Over time, this protection reshapes behavior. People choose predictability over novelty. familiar routines over new challenges. These choices reduce risk, but they also reduce opportunities for meaningful resolution. Without resolution, energy remains guarded. The cycle reinforces itself. Aging intensifies this pattern because recovery becomes slower and less reliable. The body becomes more cautious not out of fear, but out of experience. It has learned that recovery may not fully arrive. Another subtle change occurs in how the body interprets pleasure and reward. Reward systems evolve to signal successful energy investment. When investment rarely leads to closure, reward signaling weakens. Pleasure feels muted. Satisfaction is brief. This further reduces motivation to engage deeply. The person may describe feeling tired of things that once felt fulfilling. Biologically, this reflects a system that no longer trusts the return on energy. Importantly, this state does not mean decline is inevitable. It means the system is operating under constrained assumptions. Those assumptions were learned through prolonged imbalance. The body has concluded that energy must be preserved rather than circulated. Circulation is how vitality is maintained. Preservation is how stability is maintained. Both have value, but when preservation dominates, life feels narrower. Exhaustion, in this context, is not merely low energy, it is low confidence in recovery. And this brings us to a crucial turning point in the inquiry. If exhaustion reshapes how the body allocates and protects energy over time, what happens when this protective stance becomes the dominant mode of living in later life, shaping not just fatigue, but identity, expectation, and the sense of what is possible? When this protective stance persists, it gradually reshapes how later life is experienced. Energy conservation becomes not just a response, but a way of being. The body organizes itself around avoidance of loss rather than pursuit of renewal. Activities are chosen based on how little they cost rather than how much they might restore. This shift is subtle and often invisible from the outside. A person may appear calm, stable, and well-adjusted, yet feel internally constrained. The range of engagement narrows. Life feels manageable but less alive. This is not resignation. It is biological prudence. The system has learned, through repeated experience, that recovery is uncertain. It responds by minimizing exposure. Over time, this minimization shapes identity. People begin to see themselves as naturally low energy, easily tired, or limited by age. These descriptions feel accurate, but they reflect adaptation rather than essence. Biology responds to these expectations. When the body believes that high energy is no longer possible, it stops preparing for it. Repair systems prioritize maintenance over regeneration. Stress responses become conservative. Surplus is no longer anticipated. This anticipation matters because the body invests differently when it expects renewal. Without that expectation, even small efforts feel costly. Social engagement becomes selective. Curiosity quiets. The world feels demanding not because it has changed, but because the body has stopped budgeting for expansion. Importantly, this transformation does not happen because the body is failing. It happens because the body is trying to survive within perceived limits. In earlier environments, these limits were temporary. Modern exhaustion makes them feel permanent. For older adults, this permanence is especially convincing. Years of incomplete recovery accumulate into a belief that this is simply how life is now. Biology follows belief when belief is reinforced by experience. Exhaustion becomes self-confirming, yet this does not mean reversal is impossible. It means that the system requires evidence, not encouragement. It needs repeated signals that energy can be spent and returned safely. Without those signals, conservation remains the safest strategy. Exhaustion, in this sense, is not emptiness. It is caution made visible. It reflects a body that has learned to endure rather than to circulate energy freely. And this leads to a final, deeper question. If exhaustion in later life is shaped not only by aging, but by years of learned conservation, what would it take for the body to believe once again that recovery is possible, and that energy is allowed to move rather than hide? Exhaustion takes on a different meaning when it is understood not as a malfunction, but as information. In the final stage of this inquiry, the body's fatigue can be seen as a message shaped by long-term experience. The body is not simply low on energy. It is communicating that the conditions required for safe circulation of energy are no longer present. Over years of unresolved effort, incomplete recovery, and guarded engagement, the system has learned to interpret the world as a place where energy is spent more easily than it is returned. This interpretation becomes embodied. Hormones adjust, neural thresholds shift, motivation recalibrates. None of this happens consciously. The body responds to patterns, not intentions. When patterns repeatedly deny closure and restoration, exhaustion becomes a rational outcome. For older adults, this message is often misunderstood. Fatigue is attributed to age itself, as if aging were a process of inevitable depletion. Yet aging alone does not explain the character of modern exhaustion. Earlier generations aged under different conditions and did not report the same persistent background fatigue. What has changed is not the human lifespan, but the environment in which that lifespan unfolds. Exhaustion, in this context, is not a sign that the body is failing faster. It is a sign that the body has adapted carefully to conditions that no longer support renewal. This reframing matters because it removes moral judgment from fatigue. Being tired is not a personal shortcoming. It is not a lack of discipline or resilience. It is a protective signal. The body is saying that the balance between demand and recovery has been lost for too long. It is choosing preservation because circulation no longer feels safe. Seen this way, exhaustion becomes a form of wisdom. It reflects a system that has learned from experience and adjusted to survive. This does not make the state desirable, but it makes it intelligible. Understanding precedes change. Without understanding, exhaustion is treated as an enemy to be defeated. With understanding, it becomes a guide pointing toward what is missing. Importantly, the body does not require dramatic interventions to change its expectations. It responds to consistency rather than intensity. Just as it learned to conserve through repeated imbalance, it can relearn circulation through repeated evidence of safe recovery. But evidence must come from experience, not instruction. The body listens to what happens, not to what is promised. This is why advice alone rarely alters deep exhaustion. The system needs to see energy return again and again before it trusts release. Until then, caution remains. Exhaustion persists not because the body is stubborn, but because it is careful. In the context of later life, this care is amplified. With fewer reserves and slower repair, the cost of misjudgment is higher. The body protects what remains. This protection can feel like limitation, but it is also an invitation to listen. Fatigue is asking a question rather than making a statement. It is asking whether the conditions of life still allow energy to move freely, or whether preservation remains the safest choice. And that brings us to the final reflection. If exhaustion is not an enemy but a signal shaped by long experience, what might change if we stop trying to silence it, and instead asked what it has been trying to tell us all along? When the body has learned caution through years of imbalance, it does not respond to forceful change. It responds to permission. Permission is conveyed not through effort, but through patterns that consistently signal safety. In early human life, these patterns were embedded in the environment. Light faded predictably, activity slowed naturally, social demands resolved visibly. The body did not have to decide whether recovery was allowed. It was shown. In modern life, this showing rarely occurs. Recovery is suggested, but not demonstrated. Rest is scheduled, but not protected. The body remains unconvinced. To change this, the system requires repeated experiences where energy is spent and reliably returned without penalty. Small cycles matter more than large interventions. A single deep rest does not rebuild trust. Consistent closure does. When effort ends clearly and recovery follows fully, the body notes the pattern. Over time, these notes accumulate. Caution softens. Energy release becomes less guarded. This process is slow because it must override long experience. For older adults, slowness is not a flaw. It is a feature of careful systems. The body does not rush toward optimism. It tests. Another important element is predictability. The body restores more easily when it can anticipate rest rather than negotiate it. Uncertainty keeps systems alert. Predictable rhythms allow anticipation of release. This anticipation itself conserves energy. It lowers vigilance before rest begins. Without anticipation, recovery is shallow. This is why fragmented schedules and irregular demands are so exhausting. Even when total activity is low, the body is always preparing, never arriving. Rest arrives without warning and leaves without confirmation. Nothing settles. Over time, rebuilding energy requires restoring these anticipatory cues, not by controlling behavior tightly, but by allowing patterns to repeat without interruption. This repetition is what signals safety. It tells the body that energy circulation will not lead to loss. Another key factor is meaning. The body releases energy more freely when it senses that effort leads somewhere finite. Completion matters. Even small completions count if they are clear. Ambiguity drains more than difficulty. When actions end cleanly, the nervous system stands down. When they blur into the next demand, it remains engaged. Over years, this distinction shapes fatigue more than intensity ever could. Importantly, none of this requires youth, strength, or ambition. It requires alignment. Alignment between effort and rest, between expectation and outcome, between what the body gives and what it receives. When alignment improves, exhaustion often softens without being directly targeted. Energy returns not as a surge, but as a quiet widening of capacity. Tasks feel lighter, rest feels deeper, life feels less defended. This is not a promise of constant vitality. Aging still brings limits, but limits feel different when energy is allowed to circulate. They feel like edges rather than walls. Exhaustion, in this light, is not a verdict. It is feedback. It reports on whether the conditions of life support completion and recovery. When those conditions improve, the message changes. And this brings the inquiry toward its final pause. If exhaustion has always been a signal rather than a failure, and if the body responds to patterns more than effort, what might happen over time if life were arranged not to defeat tiredness, but to answer it? At the end of this long arc, exhaustion no longer appears as something to be corrected, optimized, or eliminated. It appears as a response that has been shaped carefully over time. The body has been paying attention. It has noticed when effort did not resolve, when rest did not restore, when days ended without closure and nights began without guidance. In response, it adjusted. It slowed circulation. It narrowed investment. It chose preservation over risk. This choice was not made once. It was reinforced thousands of times, quietly through daily life. Seen this way, exhaustion is not emptiness. It is memory. It carries the record of environments that asked for energy without guaranteeing return. In later life, this record weighs more heavily because there is less margin for error. The body becomes selective not because it has failed, but because it has learned. Learning is what allowed humans to survive across changing worlds. Fatigue, in this sense, is not the opposite of wisdom. It is one of its forms. Yet wisdom does not mean immobility. It means responsiveness to patterns. Just as the body learned to conserve under prolonged imbalance, it can learn again if the pattern changes. Not through force, not through urgency, but through consistency. When effort ends clearly, when rest is protected, when rhythms repeat without interruption, the body notices. It does not rush to trust, but it observes. Over time, caution can soften, energy can circulate without fear, not dramatically, not endlessly, but enough to restore a sense of ease. This is not a promise of youth or constant vitality. Aging still brings limits. But limits feel different when energy is allowed to move. They feel navigable rather than enclosing. Exhaustion then shifts from being a permanent background to being an occasional signal once more, a message that arrives and leaves. The body has always known how to do this. It has done it before, under very different skies. The question is not whether the body can recover, but whether the conditions of life allow it to believe that recovery is still possible. And so the story does not end with an answer, but with an invitation to listen. If exhaustion has been speaking all along, shaped by years of experience, what might we hear if we finally stopped trying to outrun it and instead allowed it to tell us what it has been waiting for?